My friends, there are moments when history does not simply whisper. It strikes with such force that we cannot sit still, cannot look away, cannot avoid asking ourselves the most urgent of questions. What kind of future are we prepared to fight for? And what kind of tomorrow will we allow to be taken from us? For Burkina Faso, and for the whole of Africa, that thunderous moment has arrived. Without warning and without justification, the United States carried out a deliberate military assault on the very heart of Burkina Faso. This was not an error, not confusion, not the fog of war. It was deliberate. It was calculated. It was a signal designed to terrify, to break the spirit of a people, and to send a chilling warning to every African nation that dares to choose its own path. But here is the truth: the flames they hoped to smother are now raging stronger than ever. What they unleashed is not submission, but unity, not despair, but courage, not silence, but an unstoppable cry for sovereignty. We gather now not to drown in speculation, not to lose ourselves in hollow rage, but to drag truth into the open, to lay bare why this moment matters, and to make clear how it could redefine not just Burkina Faso's fate, but Africa's standing in the world. At this turning point, leaders like Ibrahim Traore do not only shoulder the burden of one small nation, they carry the heartbeat, the anguish, and the hope of an entire continent. The question burns before us: is this the long-awaited beginning of Africa's awakening, or will it be another chapter of chains forged by foreign hands? The story of Africa cannot forever be drafted in offices thousands of miles away. It must be told, spoken, and lived by her own children. What is unfolding now is not a footnote. It is a new chapter written in sacrifice, defiance, and an unshakable will to rise. If you believe in this awakening, if you believe Africa's destiny belongs to its people and not to outsiders, then raise your voice. Stand with us. Like this video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to a movement that will not be silenced. Over the vast skies of the Sahel, a murmur rose into a thunderous roar, the kind of sound that shakes the earth before the eye even grasps the danger. Then, without a whisper of warning, two precision-guided bombs ripped through the dawn and slammed into a small outpost in Burkina Faso's northern Yatana province. The destruction was immediate and merciless. 3 souls lost: 2 soldiers faithfully guarding their posts, and 1 civilian whose day had scarcely begun. 7 others lay wounded, and the blast tore apart a critical communications tower, the very lifeline that once linked security stations protecting the region. When the dust settled, the truth became undeniable. Burkina Faso's Ministry of Defense confirmed what many had already feared in silence. This was not the work of neighbors, not the result of a shared mission gone astray. The attack had originated from U.S. Africa Command, launched from a forward base in Niger, hundreds of miles away. It was not a mistake. It was not defense. It was a calculated strike, deliberate, unilateral, and contemptuous of Burkina Faso's sovereignty. It stood in naked violation of international law and mocked the very principles carved into the UN Charter. And then came the voice of President Ibrahim Traore, firm, steady, carrying the weight of a wounded yet unbroken nation. Addressing his people in a broadcast that reached millions, he spared no words. He declared that the attack was not aimed merely at soil, steel, or buildings. It was aimed at the beating heart of Burkina Faso's freedom. It was an assault on the right of a people to stand tall and determine their own destiny. Within hours, every one of the nation's 12,000 active-duty soldiers had been placed on high alert. Reinforcements surged toward the borders with Mali and Niger, where 1,200 troops secured vulnerable crossings. Strategic defense points, Ouagadougou's airbase, Koudougou's garrison, and others lifted their readiness to the very edge of open war. But this was never only about armies or battle lines. It was about awakening the spirit of a people who refused to bow. By nightfall, Revolution Square in Ouagadougou had transformed into something greater than a plaza. It became a living symbol of defiance. Over 35,000 citizens poured into its heart, a tidal wave of bodies and voices, waving flags, pounding drums, chanting words that cracked the night sky. Our land, our right, our future. They cried a chorus so fierce it spilled across borders. West Africa's social media lit up from Dakar to Nairobi, echoing the same refrain. Journalists, radio hosts, and scholars scrambled to dissect the meaning. Was this strike a cold warning to silence any African nation daring to dream freely? Or had it ignited exactly what Western powers had hoped to suppress, a rising tide of Pan-African unity, born not from treaties or speeches, but from blood sacrifice and unshakable resolve? In Washington, officials clung to their script, insisting this was nothing more than a precise anti-terror strike. But across Africa, those words fell like salt into an open wound. Memories of a century of foreign interference rose again raw and unhealed, reminding nations of the old pattern, promises of partnership masking the hand of domination. What was meant to intimidate had already collapsed into failure. Instead of standing isolated, Ibrahim Traore was being carried by the tide of a continent, lifted not only as the leader of Burkina Faso, but as a living emblem of African resistance. And that moment was not the end, it was the spark. The true shift came when the echoes spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Addis Ababa, the corridors of the African Union surged with urgency as an emergency summit was convened with a speed rarely seen in its history. The message was unmistakable: what began in Yatna was no longer a local wound. It had become a continental reckoning. Within hours, Africa's top diplomats were drawn into an extraordinary virtual assembly. Screens lit up with the faces of representatives from 42 nations, and their words carried a single conviction: this was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. This was an African injury, and it demanded an African reply. When President Ibrahim Traoré's image filled the chamber, projected larger than life, the hall sank into a heavy silence. His voice emerged steady and deliberate, each word striking like a hammer on steel. He told them plainly, if sovereignty can be stolen from one African nation without consequence, then no nation is safe. Burkina Faso must not be left to stand alone, and neither should any of you. The ripple was immediate. Mali, Nigeria, and Guinea, already defiant against Western dictates, issued searing denunciations. Senegal and Ghana, once closer to Washington, broke ranks and demanded answers, calling for respect for Africa's independence. On the streets, the people made their own verdict clear. In Bamako, nearly 50,000 citizens poured onto Independence Avenue, waving Burkina Faso's flags as though they were their own colors. In Conakry, mourners filled the night with candlelight outside the Burkinabe embassy, honoring the 3 lives taken. And in Nairobi, despite long-standing ties with the U.S., determined voices rose in chants for solidarity, cutting through the city's traffic like wildfire racing through dry savanna. The story consumed the continent. Radio waves crackled with callers demanding action. Enough compromise voices shouted enough foreign armies on African soil. This was no longer a local tragedy, it had become a pan-African rallying cry. For the first time in decades, analysts spoke not of theories, but of urgent plans to build a continental, rapid response force, an African shield ready to deter, and if need be, to defend against outside aggression. As one Nigerian security scholar said bluntly, what happened to Burkina Faso today could happen to any of us tomorrow. Unity, once dismissed as a dream, now appeared to be the only road to survival. In Washington, the mood shifted to defensiveness. The Pentagon tried to cloak the strike as a counter-terror operation, claiming credible intelligence of threats to U.S. assets in the Sahel. Yet when pressed for evidence, there were no names, no photos, no proof, only empty assertions. In New York, Burkina Faso's ambassador forced an emergency session of the UN Security Council. For 3 tense hours, the chamber became a battlefield of words. African envoys condemned the attack. Russia and China accused Washington of trampling international law, and France, careful not to sever ties, muttered vague calls for restraint, words that rang hollow to a continent that had heard them too many times before. Media coverage fractured along lines the world has come to expect. African outlets placed the human cost at the center, weaving the tragedy into the longer history of foreign interference that generations have endured. Meanwhile, much of the Western press framed the story through the language of instability and terror threats, reshaping the narrative to rationalize intervention and bury sovereignty as though it were a minor detail, when in truth it was the very core of the crisis. On social platforms, African commentators, activists, and influencers lit a fire under the debate, exposing how global media twisted the story, demanding that sovereignty be recognized not as a footnote, but as the beating heart of the matter. Then came the unexpected turn. Nations that rarely shared the same page found a common chord. Algeria and South Africa released a rare joint statement affirming Burkina Faso's right to defend its soil and its people. Beyond the continent, voices from Brazil and Malaysia echoed the same warning: the world must never allow brute military power to set the precedent above sovereignty. With those words, the strike on Burkina Faso transformed. It ceased to be a single nation's wound and became the spark for new unlikely alliances, carrying the possibility of shifting the very balance of global politics. Perhaps the most striking response emerged not from Africa's soil, but from its far-flung children. Across the great cities of the West in Paris, London, New York, and beyond, the African diaspora surged into the streets. Burkina Faso communities alongside Pan-African groups turned boulevards and avenues into rivers of resistance. Hundreds gathered their chants, reverberating off stone walls and glass towers, their banners painted with a message stripped of diplomacy. This strike was not an isolated act. It was the colonial mentality reborn in the camouflage of modern militarism. For President Ibrahim Traore, the moment was a double-edged blade. On one hand, Burkina Faso stood under the harsh, unblinking spotlight of international scrutiny. On the other, he himself had been thrust almost overnight into the center of a widening global debate on sovereignty and what true independence must mean in the 21st century. His task was no longer to simply condemn an attack. It was to capture the momentum to mold outrage into action, to transform grief into resolve, and to keep the world's attention fixed before the glare faded and the stage moved on. Inside Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou became a city with two faces, half fortress, half gathering ground. Security checkpoints sprang up across wide boulevards. Soldiers in fatigues lined corners, guarding ministries, airports, and vital communication hubs, their weapons slung but ready. The government confirmed that more than 4,000 additional troops had been mobilized nationwide to shield the country from further strikes or unrest. Yet the military buildup was only part of the story. In parallel, the administration scrambled to steady a fragile economy. Emergency measures sought to stabilize grain and fuel supplies, knowing that even a whisper of panic could send prices soaring beyond reach. Despite those efforts, strain came fast. Diesel prices spiked by more than 12%. In the northern provinces nearest the blast zone, the cost of basic food staples surged by 8 to 10%. For families already stretched to their limits, the burden pressed heavier with each passing day. Yet the deepest wound was not measured in percentages or in lost towers. It was the shattering of a nation's sense of safety. In Ouagadougou, near the strike site, schools shut their doors as parents held their children close, fearing the sky itself. Local radio programs overflowed with frantic voices, citizens demanding answers. What shield exists if the darkness returns? What promise of protection is left when even the air above your home is no longer your own? The fear was never just of American planes. It was of the harsher truth that small nations in volatile regions remain exposed, forced to face the world's storms without shelter unless unity and sovereignty can forge them a shield stronger than steel. The government chose not to retreat into silence, but to answer with visible presence. Ministers fanned out into the affected regions, holding open forums where citizens could question them directly as they outlined new security measures and diplomatic maneuvers. State television became the nation's nightly pulse, broadcasting updates on defense readiness, humanitarian convoys, and tense negotiations unfolding on the international stage. The message was unmistakable. This was not a government hiding in shadows, but one determined to project control, restore confidence, and keep fear from devouring the public spirit. Yet civil society was not content to simply applaud. Many celebrated Traoré's uncompromising defiance, but activists pushed harder, demanding transparency. They wanted more than speeches, they wanted evidence. They asked what intelligence, if any, justified America's claim of terrorist threats in Burkina Faso's north. A respected lawyer in Ouagadougou gave voice to the sentiment, "Our sovereignty is sacred, yes, but sovereignty must also be defended with truth, not only with words." The public mood, however, spoke volumes. Polls revealed an immediate surge in support, the president's approval leaping from 62% to 78%. For a population weary of bending beneath foreign dictates, the image of a young leader daring to challenge a superpower resonated deeply. In their eyes, Traoré had transcended the role of president. He had become a voice of defiance, speaking not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa itself. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Washington found itself shaken by the fallout. The Burkina Faso strike had exploded into an unexpected storm inside the American political establishment. The Senate Armed Services Committee demanded a classified briefing from the Pentagon. Lawmakers on the Foreign Relations Committee questioned openly why such a strike had been ordered without consultation, and whether the United States had stumbled into igniting a fire it could no longer contain. Senator Mark Rutledge of Illinois captured the unease growing in America's corridors of power. He warned that striking inside sovereign nations, without their consent, put the U.S. on a dangerous path, not only in moral terms, but in long-term strategic cost. Scrambling to contain the blowback, the State Department attempted to recast the narrative, insisting the strike had targeted an imminent extremist threat and vaguely claiming intelligence from regional partners. But behind closed doors, diplomats admitted a damning truth. Neither the African Union nor the government of Burkina Faso had been consulted. That fact alone ignited fierce criticism from human rights groups and Africa-focused policy institutes who denounced the move as reckless, arrogant, and profoundly disrespectful. Across Europe, responses split along familiar seams. France, still reeling from its own setbacks in the Sahel, spoke cautiously, calling for dialogue, while carefully avoiding direct condemnation of Washington. Germany and Italy, by contrast, expressed sharper discontent with Berlin, warning bluntly that no alliance can endure without trust. Russia and China seized the moment, branding the strike as modern-day imperialism and offering open rhetorical support for Traoré, while signaling readiness to deepen both military and economic ties with Burkina Faso. The global media mirrored these divides. In the United States, mainstream outlets like CNN and Fox repeated the Pentagon's framing, highlighting the alleged terrorist threat above all else. Yet independent voices such as NPR and The Intercept challenged the narrative, raising questions about legality, strategy, and morality. In Europe, publications from Le Monde to The Guardian ran essays warning that the strike could accelerate Africa's slow but steady drift away from Western alliances. On the African continent, broadcasters told a very different story. They placed sovereignty at the center, looping Traoré's fiery speeches, replaying images of mass protests across African capitals, and amplifying voices of citizens who accused Western media of deliberately muting the reality of African solidarity. Inside policy circles from Washington to Brussels, a sobering question spread like a shadow across the room: had the United States miscalculated the storm it had just unleashed? Both in symbol and in substance, the strike had provoked a backlash far greater than strategists had dared to imagine. Burkina Faso's leadership wasted no time harnessing that momentum and turning it into decisive shifts. Symbolically, Traoré's government declared that every military agreement with Western nations would be placed under review, pledging that only those partnerships built on equality and respect for sovereignty would survive. Practically, this translated into scaling back joint training exercises with U.S. forces, while quietly deepening technical and logistical cooperation with non-Western allies. The most dramatic rupture came soon after, when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three nations, joined not only by borders, but by the shared scars of insecurity, signed a collective defense pact in Bamako. The agreement bound them together with a simple promise: if one member were struck by a foreign power, without its consent, the others would rise in defense. Analysts swiftly gave it a name: the Sahel Shield Alliance, and interpreted it as a direct challenge not only to U.S. Africa Command, but to the lingering shadow of French influence in the region. This realignment did not remain confined to the Sahel. Algeria, long a silent heavyweight in North Africa, quietly convened a confidential summit, bringing together envoys from Burkina Faso, Chad, and Guinea. Leaks revealed that the agenda was nothing short of transformative discussions on a joint intelligence sharing framework, pooled funding for indigenous arms development, and strategies to free the region from its dependency on European and American weaponry. For Washington, the consequences were stark and immediate. Influence that had taken 2 decades of counterterrorism cooperation to build was unraveling in weeks. U.S. diplomats privately admitted that their channels to Sahelian leaders had not been this restricted since the early 2000s. Inside the Pentagon, internal memos warned that the Sahel Shield Alliance threatened to severely complicate intelligence gathering against jihadist networks. What had begun as a single strike was now cascading into a realignment that threatened to redraw the entire balance of power in West Africa. Ironically, the very argument used to justify the strike in Burkina Faso began to echo uneasily through European capitals. French defense officials warned that every Western misstep risked opening the door wider for Russia, Turkey, and China to expand their foothold across West Africa. Russian broadcasters wasted no time in seizing the moment. Their coverage framed Ibrahim Traore as a modern-day African patriot, standing unbent against neo-colonial pressure. Night after night, Francophone Africa's screens filled with images of him portrayed as a leader whose defiance represented not just Burkina Faso, but the dignity and awakening of an entire continent. These diplomatic ripples only deepened Traoré's strength at home. Polling from Ouagadougou's Institute of Public Opinion revealed overwhelming support. Over 80% of citizens stood behind the government's foreign policy pivot. For many, it was not about ideology, but about something more visceral: sovereignty, dignity, and Pan-African solidarity. For decades, Africa's story had been scarred by leaders who dared to resist Western dominance only to be isolated, undermined, or erased in silence. Yet in the aftermath of this strike, Traoré began to break that cycle, not through empty slogans, but through deliberate, concrete steps that his people could see and feel. Within only a matter of weeks, he was no longer just a young leader of a small nation. He had become a central figure at the highest tables of African power. At the extraordinary African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, cameras captured him walking shoulder to shoulder with presidents old enough to be his teacher's men who had carried the burdens of leadership for decades. He was the youngest head of state in the hall yet. When he spoke, his voice carried the gravity of someone forged by struggle. Sovereignty, he declared, is not a gift that others bestow. It is a responsibility we must seize, and it belongs only to those who dare to defend it. His camouflage uniform, unpolished, unmistakable, took on a life of its own, becoming a symbol broadcast into millions of homes. To many, it was a reminder that he did not emerge from the ranks of polished politicians, but from the trenches of the people themselves. For Africans watching from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, he became the proof that the continent's future need not be dictated from foreign capitals, but could be authored by its own sons and daughters. His speeches did not remain confined to conference halls. They raced across television screens and through social media feeds, sparking admiration, fierce debates, and even calls for action in neighboring countries. But his influence went deeper than words. His administration began reshaping the legal architecture of resource management, ensuring that contracts over gold, manganese, and other minerals placed national welfare above foreign extraction. This was no rhetorical flourish. It was a direct assault on one of the oldest chains of domination, Africa's plundered wealth. When Western donors threatened to suspend aid in retaliation, Traoré's government did not flinch. Instead, it pivoted swiftly toward African and Asian partners, filling financial gaps and defying the economic collapse critics predicted. The message could not have been clearer. Dependency was not destiny, it was a decision, and Burkina Faso had chosen another road. Then came a moment that confirmed the struggle was continental, not isolated. Another foreign strike, a drone attack in Niger, claimed the lives of 4 civilians under the all-too-familiar banner of counterterrorism. Outrage swept through Niamey like fire through dry grass. Within a day, Niger's transitional leadership reached out to Traoré, seeking a united stand. And together, standing side by side with their defense ministers, the two leaders declared with one unyielding voice, "The era of unilateral foreign strikes in Africa is over." The broadcast thundered across the continent, carried by networks from Morocco down to South Africa. For the first time, multiple West African governments had spoken with a single defiant clarity against foreign military intrusion. The resonance was immediate and contagious. Mali, Guinea, and Chad echoed their support with joint statements. In East Africa, Tanzania and Uganda added their voices. Even parliaments in nations historically bound to Western security arrangements began to openly question whether hosting foreign bases without oversight still served the interests of their people. What had begun as the defiance of one nation was rapidly evolving into the chorus of a continent. Across the borders of ethnicity and language, from the mossy heartlands of Burkina Faso to the desert plains of the Tuareg in Mali, and through the bustling Hausa communities of Niger, one truth rang out with undeniable force. Africa's security, its resources, and above all its dignity, must be defended by Africans themselves. For millions watching the sight of Ibrahim Traore, standing shoulder to shoulder with Niger's leadership was no mere act of diplomatic ritual. It was the embodiment of a transformation, long whispered in quiet corners of conferences and policy rooms, but seldom carried into bold and decisive action. On the diplomatic front, this emerging alliance unsettled every Western calculation in the Sahel. For Traoré, it was not the product of impulse, but of patience and deliberate craft. He resisted reckless escalation, kept fragile domestic stability intact, and methodically built a coalition strong enough to ensure that striking against him would come with a price too high to pay. In the heart of West Africa, a young leader had dug his heels into the soil of history, and in doing so began to bend its arc toward a different future. Ibrahim Traore had never sought this confrontation, but when it arrived uninvited on the soil of Burkina Faso, he chose his path with clarity. He chose resistance instead of submission, solidarity instead of fear. What was designed to break a nation instead became the spark that illuminated a continent. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the avenues of Nairobi, from Dakar's coastline to Dar es Salaam's harbors, voices rose as one carrying a single defiant cry. Africa's sovereignty is not for sale, not for bargaining, not for negotiation. That sovereignty belongs to those who walk its lands, speak its countless tongues till its soil, and carry within their hearts the dreams of its tomorrow. Burkina Faso's road ahead remains treacherous, its journey unfinished, its obstacles many. Pressures will mount, enemies will circle, and hardships will multiply. Yet the spirit awakened in this moment will not be easily extinguished. As Traoré himself declared, his words echoing like a drumbeat across the continent, "We do not beg for freedom, we rise and we claim it."